Thank you so much, Ellen, and thank you all so much for joining us. Welcome. I hope everyone's staying both safe and also sane in quarantine. Especially welcome to those of you who have joined us, who had originally planned to attend this at the SASTR conference, obviously, which was canceled. We definitely appreciate you all sticking with us through this. In my experience, as Ellen mentioned, across my 14 years, across many different industries, many different regions, I've begun to see a move to, thankfully, some international standards related to compliance and security, largely driven by security needs in cloud environments. Clouds obviously know no nationalities, and therefore the security and compliance requirements are also beginning to harmonize. And SOC 2 seems to be a standard that has become very popular for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about. We're going to start off with a quick intro to SOC 2. What is it? Where did it come from? Why is it so important? And then we'll run through a basic 3-step process, a roadmap, if you will, of preparing your business for SOC 2. I can't guarantee that in half an hour we will take you from knowing absolutely nothing to being ready to implement and execute SOC 2, but we can at least give you some relevant starting points, some ideas, thoughts, and places where maybe some common pitfalls might occur. I've seen organizations with everything from completely unrealistic timelines to absolutely no knowledge of which SOC report they actually need to get. So hopefully we can get you on the right path. Close with some parting thoughts and then a brief discussion of the different services that both Cobalt as well as Euro can offer related to securing your SaaS or company's offerings. And then, as Ellen mentioned, we will have the Q&A session at the end. First up, what is a SOC 2 report? Who is the target audience for this report? And what are some of the benefits and drivers that would actually cause you as a SaaS business to maybe look at getting a SOC 2 report? Before we even start with that, I want to make a very important point. Compliance frameworks like SOC 2, not the same thing as security. The two are very closely related. We'll talk about what the SOC 2 report actually is, but I do want to make sure that no one is abrogating their responsibility for properly implementing security controls, properly managing their cyber risk just because they've checked all of the relevant boxes in a compliance framework. Many retailers who have undergone very embarrassing data breaches had a couple of compliance reports, but fell down when it came time to actually implement good, robust security. SOC stands for Service Organization Controls, and many of you might have been familiar with the predecessor to the SOC report, which was the SAS 70, especially if you did any work with outsourced data centers, co-location providers, or some early outsourced or business process management firms. One point of confusion and one place where I find people often can't figure out what's going on, this is a standard propagated by the AICPA, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. What the heck are accountants doing in a cybersecurity standard? Well, SAS 70 originally was designed for organizations providing outsourced payroll, outsourced financial management services. So it made sense that AICPA would publish that standard, but as business process outsourcing became more popular, SAS 70 was the closest thing that we had to a common standard that everyone could use. AICPA recognized that the SAS 70 was being used in ways that did not make sense, and so they've evolved it to the SOC framework. When we talk about SOC reports, you will also often hear incorrectly used terminology, SSAE 16, more recently SSAE 18. Long and complicated acronym, stands for Statement on Standards for Attestation Engagements. Basically what that means is this is the auditor's rule book or playbook for conducting an audit against the SOC standard. So not something that you as an organization necessarily need to worry about. That's really more the purview of the auditor that you get in to do your SOC 2 audit. At the end of that audit, the auditor will issue an opinion. So a SOC 2 report really represents the auditor's opinion based on the tests that they conducted, based on the evidence that they collected and observed, their opinion on how well your organization is meeting the standard set forth in the SOC 2 framework. We throw some numbers in here, and this is a common area of confusion that I found. There are both SOC 1 and SOC 2 reports, and both of those can come in one of two flavors, type 1 or type 2. Pretty simple, we'll break it down here. SOC 1 is primarily designed for financial controls, not something that most of us as organizations providing some sort of business process as a service, software as a service, not really something relevant to what we're doing. SOC 2, this is the one that's really useful for SaaS companies. This deals with the security controls, the privacy controls that we as SaaS providers have implemented in our services. The two different types, type 1 reports are simply a review of design. The auditor looks at the control program that you have designed, compares it against the relevant framework standard, and issues an opinion on how well the program you've designed meets that standard. The key thing that's missing there, and what's contained in a type 2 report, is actually conducting tests of operating effectiveness. So in a type 2 report, the auditor not only reviews your documentation, they also go and conduct tests. They interview your employees, they ask for artifacts coming out of your business process. They may examine systems to make sure that they are configured properly according to the controls that you've designed. So most organizations, especially when we talk about business partners who want to review your security, they're going to be looking for a SOC 2 type 2 report. As I mentioned, the audience for the SOC 2 report is probably going to be your customers, people who are consuming the services that you provide. If you're providing some sort of HR as a service in a platform, I'm sure we're all familiar with providers in that space. These organizations have people trusting them with highly sensitive data, employee social security numbers, payroll information, benefits information, stuff like that. Those consumers are looking for assurance that you have properly baked security into your services. They are looking for assurance, some trust, that if they hand over their information and their data to you, you're not going to be the cause of a data breach. That's one of the benefits a SOC 2 report can provide. Another is to enable new businesses. Many organizations are much more security conscious. I think we've all seen major security breaches make front page news. So many businesses are now using the security of their business partners as a discriminator when making business decisions. I'm going to pick somebody who has a more mature security program to do business with versus somebody who does not have one. I mentioned that security and compliance are not the same thing. However, the process of going through and implementing the SOC 2 framework, going through the process of becoming SOC 2 compliant can actually help you to improve or mature your own infosec risk management capabilities. Implementing SOC 2 is not a security activity in and of itself. The SOC 2 report really allows you to communicate with your customers, with those consumers of your services, all of the great stuff that your business is doing to manage your cybersecurity and infosec risk. Lastly, some of the drivers that many of you may face, things that cause you to think about SOC 2 or pursue SOC 2, contractual obligations. I have seen this more and more frequently in contracts, especially around cloud services. The consumers want the provider to be SOC 2 compliant. This can also be the result of an overwhelming number of third-party vendor risk management questionnaires or customer requests. People want to come in and do an on-site audit of your services, of your organization. You can end up spending more time auditing than you do actually providing services. So getting a SOC 2 report can be a way to say, hey, customers, we're not going to let you poke around in our systems. We're going to share with you our SOC 2 report. That should give you the assurance that you need that our security program is up to snuff. And lastly, I am beginning to see a growth to a marketing or business strategy differentiator. The SOC 2 report is something that you can share as sort of a gold star that your company has earned, showing your customers that you are the more secure solution than some of your competitors. We're going to take a three-step look at how to prepare and get yourself ready to undergo a SOC 2 audit, starting with scoping as well as the trust services criteria. When we talk about scope in an audit, we are talking about the area or the stuff that is subject to an audit. This can be as small as one individual system, something that you provide to your customers, You can also scope SOC 2 to cover your entire organization. Key recommendation from my time working in the field: start small and grow over time. Unless there is an absolute business driver for you, I would not recommend trying to cover your entire organization in your first SOC 2 audit. It's going to be a lot of work to implement the controls. It's going to be a lot of work to get everything working and moving in the right direction, and probably not going to be a successful outcome. Within the SOC 2 framework, there are what are known as the Trust Services Criteria, TSCs. You may also hear these referred to as Trust Service Principles, TSPs. The criteria are basically the requirements that your business needs to meet in order to undergo a SOC 2 audit, what your auditors are actually going to be comparing against. Key point here is that these should be tailored to your business, to your organization, to your particular services. You should not try to implement all of the criteria. SOC 2 is something of a choose your own adventure. You should pick the criteria most applicable to the type of business that you are actually conducting. Other key thing here, kind of scary sounding term, but carving out anything that you acquire from your service providers. What does that mean? Basically, if you're using AWS to host your production environment, Amazon is the one that's on the hook to provide physical security for their data centers. Those requirements are carved out of your responsibility. And when your auditors review your control program, they are going to refer to Amazon's SOC 2 to see how those particular controls are being satisfied. So what are the TSCs? Got a couple of them. Frequently referred to using their abbreviation. So you see those here in parentheses. There is the security criteria, basically the ability of your organization to protect the information that you store and process, abbreviated CC because these are common criteria. Availability, abbreviated as A. This is the accessibility of information and systems for your customers. This is basically where you talk about things like uptime. How much uptime do you provide your customers? 3 nines, 5 nines, etc. Processing integrity, or PI, primarily is important for organizations providing some sort of financial outsourced service. These criteria speak to the completeness as well as the accuracy of information that is processed by your systems. If an organization trusts you to provide processing for their financial data, they need to make sure that that financial data maintains its integrity, especially if they are a public company and have to have their own financial statements audited. Confidentiality, abbreviated with just one C, is the ability of your organization to protect the confidential information that has been entrusted to it. And lastly, and very much growing in importance, privacy, abbreviated P. This is the ability of your systems and your organizational controls to uphold common tenets of privacy regulations. And of course, I'm sure all of us have heard some of the emerging standards, things like GDPR, CCPA. Common tenets of these privacy frameworks include consent. People need to give you consent to use their data. You should limit the processing of that data to just the purpose for which you've gathered consent. Data subjects should have access to their data, and so on, all the way through to the disposal of data when your organization no longer needs it. So those are the criteria. What do you actually do to begin implementing the controls that you need? Well, recommendation here, use the PPT methodology. It stands for people, process, and technology. Basically 3 buckets or 3 silos that you can look at your business operations, your organization in a holistic manner, figure out the different places where information security and cybersecurity risk exist, and therefore you can implement controls that help you meet the criteria in the SOC 2 framework. Some examples on the process side. These are controls primarily designed to reduce risk in business process. Good example is your vulnerability management program. Building and maintaining a vulnerability management program is actually really tough. There are a lot of moving parts and pieces. You have a lot of technical skills that need to be part of your team. Unfortunately, very expensive technical skills. Recommendation here, look at utilizing third parties where it makes sense. It gives you access to additional skills. It can give you access to highly trained personnel at a lower cost than having them on your staff full time. Also keep in mind, while SOC 2 does have a requirement for appropriate testing based on the type of services you provide, it's entirely possible to check that box with just an annual pen test, but that may not actually be sufficient for you to understand the risks present to your business, present to the data you're processing. A more frequent vulnerability management program, more frequent testing may help you to uncover and fix vulnerabilities faster. Goal here obviously is to stay ahead of the hackers. Over on the people side, people controls focus on risks that are either posed to your employees or your users, or that are actually posed by those people. This is where we talk about things like insider threats, accidental fat fingering of data, stuff like that. Key control for managing people risk is going to be your security training and awareness program. A couple of critical points to keep in mind. Your training and awareness content should absolutely be accessible. I have seen far too many trainings that are written almost in legalese, trainings that actually point back to laws or regulations and blocks of text copied out of those laws and regulations. Your average users are not going to get any benefit out of that. They need to understand, how does this impact the work that they do on a daily basis? They need to have context. Your training and awareness should also address current topics. Obviously, with the dramatic shift to work from home due to a global pandemic, I've seen lots of training programs being updated to deal with security when you're no longer in the office. A few years ago, when ransomware started to become a bigger threat, lots of training programs began to get updated to give people relevant information related to ransomware. Key takeaway here, you should have completion tracking. You need to make sure that people are completing their training. Also look at some performance metrics. Do you see a reduction in risky behavior after people have completed training? Monitoring that is going to help you judge the effectiveness of your training and the effectiveness of your risk mitigations. Lastly, and ironically, this is the shortest bubble, your technology controls. These are all of the automated information system controls, and this is basically the whole universe of cybersecurity companies that I'm sure many of us have heard about. The fact that it's the shortest bubble here is a little bit ironic. Examples here include things like your logical access controls, when you start talking about implementing multi-factor authentication, when you start talking about securely managing user credentials, things like password managers. This is also where all of your network controls will be put in place, things like firewalls, security groups and access control lists, virtual private networks, or virtual private clouds, as well as the encryption of data, particularly important if you are going for that confidentiality TSC. Once you figured out the controls that you need to put in place, it's really important to make sure that you have a time frame and get yourself organized to implement and get ready for your SOC 2 audit. Starting off with identifying your key internal stakeholders. This is not a project that can be completed by one single person. You do need buy-in across the organization. Executive level management is going to be critical to help drive necessary change. And obviously, if you're implementing things like network controls, you're going to need your network engineers on board. Security training program, you may need to rope in and have appropriate support from your HR department. Also, make sure that you are sizing the work based on realistic resource availability. I have seen far too many SOC 2 implementation plans where, yeah, they're optimistic that they can get everything done in 3 months and have a SOC 2 report in hand, but the reality is that's not feasible. We'll talk about why in a couple more bubbles here. Moving on to the second step, once you have buy-in, you're going to conduct a gap assessment. You need to work with a subject matter expert. This can be somebody internal to the team. This could also be an external resource, something like a CPA audit firm, or possibly a cybersecurity expert. You need to identify your existing state and any deficiencies or gaps that exist compared to the state you need to be in order to get a successful audit. You should map any of your existing controls to the SOC 2 framework. You want to make sure that you have identified anything that you're already doing that checks the right boxes. That's going to free you up to focus on those things that you still need to do. Once you have that assessment, move on to identify the work projects as well as the timelines required to implement them. And again, those should be realistic. You're not going to be able to do everything overnight. Once you have those work plans, you move on to the implementation work. This is where you need to actually start putting your controls in place. Again, the PPT methodology can be very helpful. Key point here, key stumbling block or pitfall that I've seen people fall victim to is not assigning ownership and enforcing accountability. Again, this is not a single person, single team effort. This is something that exists across the organization. You need to identify those people who are either accountable or responsible for various pieces of that implementation work. And you need to make sure that you are monitoring the progress of that work and adjusting the overall timeline. I've seen a lot of overly optimistic SOC 2 implementations. Couple of quick check-ins, 1 month, 3 months, 6 months out would have told people, hey, our original timeline was not realistic. Once you've implemented, you'll move on to do a readiness review. This is going to help you identify if your controls are in place, if you've completed all of your work, and crucially, if those controls are operating as intended, if they are appropriately reducing your cyber risks. The goal here is really to make sure that you don't get caught by surprise during an audit. You do not want your auditors to find deficiencies. You want to find and fix those before you actually go and engage the auditor. Recommended timeframe for the readiness review is about 6 to 12 months after your control implementation has completed. Now, why is that? Well, when your auditors come in for a type 2 report, they're actually looking over a time period. They want to see that your controls were in place during that time period and generating the expected results. That's why anytime somebody tells me that they're going to get a SOC 2 type 2 report in the next 3 months and they're starting from zero, I don't even continue that conversation. They may be able to implement the controls in 3 months, but then they need 6 to 12 months of actually operating those controls before their auditors are going to have enough evidence to actually review. Final step, move on to engage your auditors. Again, this will be done by a qualified CPA, someone who has the appropriate credentials. The auditor is going to come on site. They are going to review the evidence of your controls. They're going to review documentation. They're going to look at how you've designed your program. They're also going to conduct a variety of tests. They may interview personnel. They may ask for things like screenshots. They may look at technical configurations and compare those against what you've documented as your control program, and also whether or not those controls meet the requirements set forth in the SOC 2 TSCs. Parting thoughts here. Obviously, we managed to cover this in 3 slides, but as I mentioned, this is going to be a year-long effort. So keep in mind the work that you're doing, compliance and security, these are both infosec or cyber risk management activities. You are identifying risks to data that you're processing, to systems that are storing or processing information. As much as possible, try to harmonize the activities between your existing security work and any new implementation of compliance frameworks like SOC 2. Keep in mind, especially on the technology side, but across all of the PPT areas, any tools that you bring in, things like pen testing, cyber risk insurance, security awareness training platforms, these tools need to be chosen so that they cost effectively manage your cyber risk. You should not go out and pay $20,000 for a tool that helps you to mitigate a risk that only represents a $10,000 loss to your business. Keep in mind, SOC 2 is a way for you to demonstrate to your customers that you have adequately mitigated cyber risks. This is not a standalone activity. This is a way to communicate all of the great stuff that you've done internally. Be realistic about your work required and timelines. If you have, as I have often seen the case, a salesperson who says they need a SOC 2 Type 2 report within the next 90 days in order to meet their quarterly goals, you need to push back and say, hey, those quarterly goals, not realistic. We can't actually get that type of report in that time frame. And lastly, start small and mature over time. Start with one critical system, not the whole organization. Start with as few of the TSCs as make sense for your business. In my experience, many companies start with the security and confidentiality criteria because they're worried about safeguarding data. Over time, as they become more robust, as their compliance program matures, they can start adding in other criteria like availability. But if there's not an immediate driver for that during your initial implementation, it doesn't make sense to expend the extra effort. I'm going to turn it over now to Chrissy at Cobalt. She's going to give us some details on how Cobalt service offerings can help you with your SOC 2 implementation efforts. Chrissy?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today, and thank you, Aaron, for a great presentation. I will keep this short and sweet. Cobalt has created the industry's first pen testing as a service platform. The PTAS approach uses a platform to drive pen testing efficiencies by productizing old workflows and harnessing the power of a selectively sourced global talent pool. This offers creative findings and actionable results delivered directly to your dev team through our Jira and GitHub integration. It has been adopted by over 300 innovative companies like MuleSoft, GoDaddy, and HubSpot. And for your SOC 2 needs, we can start your pen test in less than 24 hours. So you can find us at www.cobalt.io. Thanks so much.
Zagro is a comprehensive cyber safety solution and insurance provider for small to mid-sized businesses. Zagro offers a suite of tools for risk mitigation and compliance, as well as insurance premiums that are tailored to the size, sector, and profile of a company. We provide comprehensive cyber insurance coverage, and our cybersecurity solution offers web app vulnerability scanning to reduce common web-based attacks, user-tailored training courses to improve employee security awareness, and a security policy management solution. And now we will begin our Q&A session. All right, so if I am ISO 2700 or 27K1 compliant, will I pass the SOC 2 audit easily or vice versa?
Great question. There's no direct crosswalk, again, because SOC 2 has sort of that element of choose your own adventure. However, many of the risk mitigations present in what's known as an ISMS, Information Security Management System, required by ISO 27001, majority of those should translate quite readily into SOC 2 compliant controls as well.
Next question. What is the fastest you've seen an org move from almost no security program to SOC 2 Type 2 compliant? From not just including the audit timeline, but also the implementation of baseline controls.
In my own personal experience with an organization that I took from nothing to SOC 2, we did it all in about 6 months. That was a very, very short period of time for the organization to implement controls, and the auditor looked at just 6 months instead of the full standard 1 year of control operation. So it was a heavily caveated report. Ultimately, I think the one thing that I would caution organizations about, we wasted a lot of time and money in doing that. Ironically, for such a short period of time, we ended up wasting a lot of time because we just didn't have enough time to think things through, identify dependencies, do proper project planning and work breakdown. So I would, unless there's like a end of the company, if we don't get this in that time period, I would say 12 months is kind of the minimum necessary.
How do security regulations like CCPA or GDPR apply to SOC 2?
Great question. SOC 2 is technically agnostic of all of those things. It is, however, a good way to get some validation on those programs, neither of which have a specified audit component. HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, in the US, also very similar set of requirements, but there's no official audit framework built on top of that. What I have seen is organizations including the privacy criteria in their SOC 2 and having the auditors compare that against the requirements laid out in GDPR, or looking at the security, confidentiality, and privacy, and having the auditors do some additional work to see how the evidence they reviewed helps the company to implement or to meet their HIPAA requirements.
If my organization has outsourced all of its technology build, how much of SOC 2, or if any, do I need?
I love GDPR because it's in excruciating detail made it quite clear that there is no such thing as the set it and forget it model of security and control. You do still retain all of the responsibility even if you have outsourced. So basically, from my point of view, I always tell people the data, if it belongs to you, if the system belongs to you, it does not matter who built it, who maintains it. It is still your responsibility to implement all of those requirements. So if you've outsourced the entire technology build, you're probably going to have a little bit more of a difficult time implementing some of the application security controls, things like secure SDLC, DevSecOps, as it's becoming more popularly known. But it is still your responsibility to make sure that those items are being done. If you have outsourced to a provider who does have SOC 2 compliance, who does have some secure development, secure hosting, that could be a carve-out situation. You can point to that organization's SOC 2 program. The one thing that's important for you to remember as an organization is you then need to get some assurance of that provider. So I'll go back to that AWS model. If you're using AWS for hosting, and you're carving out physical security controls, that's obviously Amazon's purview, they run the data centers. You as an organization using AWS still need to get a copy of their SOC 2 report once a year and review it for any findings or deficiencies that could impact you, because as part of your supply chain, a failure on Amazon's part could still lead to a data breach that ultimately you're legally liable for.
All right, next question. What's the usual cost of getting SOC 2 certified, and who are the absolutely needed players?
There's going to be a lot of angry engineers after I say this. The absolute minimum skeleton staff that I have seen is a head of engineering who knew nothing about security and compliance and took on SOC 2 as an additional responsibility. No direct cost there, because obviously that person was already on staff, but in terms of burnout and bonuses that were required to be paid out, it was a little higher. Absolute bare minimum that you need is someone internal to coordinate all of this work. Ideally, that person should have some cybersecurity or infosec experience. And then of course, you will also need an auditor. There are several audit firms, anything from small local or regional CPA firms with a SOC 2 auditing practice up to some of the big names, companies like A-Line or Shellman and Company, who are multinational or global SOC 2 auditors. Costs honestly are going to range depending on the amount of work required. Obviously, a type 1 report will run you a lot less. A type 2 report, because of the greater amount of work the auditors have to do, cheapest that I've ever seen those comes in somewhere between 12 and 25,000 in terms of just the audit piece alone. A little more difficult to scope out or give you a discrete answer on that internal resource amount of time and money required to actually make all of these changes. If you've built your organization with security in mind from the beginning, SOC 2 is usually very little work. If you have a completely chaotic, unsecured environment, you're going to need to spend a lot more time and effort working on that.
Could a SOC 2 report be gained without mobile device management, or more broadly, a complete acceptance of BYOD?
It absolutely can, and that's going to be a key part of scoping. If the mobile devices are storing, processing, or transmitting the sensitive data that your customers are concerned with, I would say those mobile devices and your MDM or BYOD controls should be part of the scope. Otherwise, your SOC 2 report not going to be very useful for your customers. It's probably not going to be a good use of your money. I have seen quite commonly organizations scope their SOC 2 to the what's known as a production environment. So whatever cloud service is being provided, where customer data lives. If employees' mobile devices are just used for company email, but no customer data lives on them, it's totally fine for those to be out of scope. And that's one of the reasons that I suggest not starting with the whole organization as your scope.
All right. My organization has many products. Is it possible to get SOC certified for one product at a time?
Absolutely. So the first thing that you'll do with the auditor is to write what's known as management's description of the system. So this is the formal definition and putting pen to paper that establishes that scope. Management definition is basically whatever the company's management is saying. This is the system where we have implemented controls in alignment with the SOC 2 framework. So if you have multiple products, if you have multiple offerings, it's absolutely the case that you could have one product that has a SOC 2 audit and another product that doesn't, or one environment, one service line that uses SOC 2 and another one that maybe uses a different standard or doesn't have any security certification at all.
All right, I think we have time for like 2 more questions. So, what's the difference between SOC 2 and SOC for cybersecurity?
Difference between SOC 2 and SOC for cybersecurity. SOC for cybersecurity, the focus is a little bit more on the whole organization. Ultimately, SOC 2 could be any service that's being provided, whether it's a technology service or not.
And why is SOC 2 required if an organization is already certified with ISO 27K1, CSA STAR, and GDPR?
It may not be required. And in fact, there are no real, what I would call hard requirements for a SOC 2 report. Unless your customers, your business partners, somebody is actually requesting this particular format for compliance and security reporting. Couple of key points, and there's almost a religious debate within the information security community on which standard or which framework is the most robust, the most useful. CSA is fairly lightweight. It doesn't cover quite as much. So if I am trusting you with highly sensitive data, a CSA STAR may not be enough for me to gain the necessary warm, fuzzy feeling that you're safeguarding my data. ISO 27001 is a very high level and somewhat loose framework. It has a lot of latitude for organizations to implement whatever they feel is appropriate for their organization. SOC 2 tends to be a little bit more prescriptive, and I can also be much more specific with that management description of the system. Again, the particular scope. ISO 27001 is kind of company-wide, not necessarily system-specific. So as a consumer of one of your services, that ISO 27001 certificate may not mean a whole lot to me because it's a little bit too broad, may not cover the specific system technical details that I'm looking for how you're safeguarding the data that I'm trusting you with. Other note on ISO, there are multiple standards within it. So ISO 27017 and 27018 deal with cloud security as well as privacy for sensitive or PII data that is being processed in a cloud environment. Those are not required for an ISO 27001 certification. So just because you already have the 27001 certificate doesn't necessarily mean your customers can get the assurance that they need. For anyone who's wondering, should I do SOC 2 privacy versus ISO 27017 and 18, that's going to be a question really answered by the needs and desires of your customers. If they're okay looking at your ISO-based control program with those two standards implemented, or if they demand a SOC 2 report, you may be required to implement the SOC 2 framework.
All right, last question. Does SOC 2 have strict control implementation requirements, or is it more like ISO 27001, where principles are provided but implementations are left to company decision?
The implementations are much more left to your decision, to your discretion, very similar to the ISO framework. The reason being, SOC 2 is not a prescriptive standard for a particular industry, for a particular type of service provider. So they do get into fairly low level of detail of what things you should be doing, but they do not tell you how to actually go about doing them. So implementing a management framework that supports information security across the organization. They don't actually tell you how to do that. I've seen implementations that range from a charter for information security, which is signed by executives. I've also seen organizations point to an infosec organization or line of business within the company that is specifically charged with that responsibility for that organization. I find it to be kind of medium prescriptive, if you will. There are some very high-level frameworks, for example, Cobalt, where all they tell you is you should secure endpoints. Okay, that's great, but not really a good starting point. And then there are obviously very technical frameworks, things like PCI, that actually get down into particular firewall configurations that they expect to see. I think SOC 2 is somewhere in the middle.
Great. Well, that is all the time that we have for today. Thanks everyone so much for joining us today. And thanks, Aaron, for your time and for your SOC 2 expertise.
Thank you, Ellen and Chrissy, as well, for facilitating all this. And thank you all for joining me today. Again, hope you all stay safe and sane.
All right. And again, you can visit www.cobalt.io to learn more about Cobalt, and zaguro.com to learn more about Zaguro. Thank you and have a wonderful day.